Existential question, why are we here? This is another video on this topic. Especially, we're going to talk about what of I that is here. This is the sixth video in the series of In the Act of Being a Muslim. My name is Irfan Sonawala. Briefly reviewing the problem of scale in the previous video, individuals feel in the magnanimous exterior natural landscape some sort of insecurity, detachment, loneliness, isolation, and displacement, and how we employ architecture in an urban setting to play the role to mediate these feelings into more comfortable conditions for ourselves. I mentioned in the previous video about the problem of size and function that immediately gets assigned not only to architecture but also to the natural settings. Functionality in which is one of the prime methods through which we appropriate our surroundings to counter our internal feelings of insecurities, detachment, loneliness, etc. Urban landscape and housing are the cosmic appropriation we make to the exterior natural landscape to our own scale. Let's call this microcosm. We create this microcosm to detach the external natural world, calling it macrocosm. In most of the older Muslim philosophers, they do not make distinction between the urban and natural. Rather, they make distinction between exterior environment that we now call nature and human's internal environment. That is the reason the human internal world, the epistemic world, that is how we think, we call microcosm in many Sufi thoughts. However, in this series of micro and macro, the problem of scale gets converted from exterior as cosmic to earthly, to urban, to communal, to family, to personal, and from there to epistemic. These are the relative series of macro and micro, not physical or biological scale, rather epistemic scale of how we identify exteriority and interiority and live with it. This epistemic series of macro and micro locates the place called here in the question of why are we here? This is the reason microcosm and macrocosm play an important role, especially Gnosticism, Sufism, in Christianity and Muslim philosophy, and many others as well. We are not just one religion, but most of them will talk about this micro and macrocosm as if there are multiple layers of the worlds, and humans are part of it. This is a very powerful idea of most of religions. The hierarchy of micro and macro attempts to put together both the question of who are we and why are we here. It creates epistemic geography to merge both the questions together. By merging the question, it actually asks, what is it of I, which is basically from who are we, what is it of I that is here of the question, why are we here? It does it by allowing humans to live at various levels at this hierarchy of micro and macro. It just doesn't see human subjects stationed at one location and witnessing it from various scales and perspective, like cosmic or earthly or communal, etc. Rather, it splits the subject, or in fact, the idea of the self itself. Epistemically, that has some important role at various levels to play. And at most of the levels, that role gets outsourced, or I must say franchised, to the most powerful split of the self, that gets to be the part of divine. I'm just trying to make a note here. The idea of franchise, I will talk about it later. I'm using the word franchise for it. We call it soul or ruh or atma in various languages and religions. The idea of ruh or soul is important in allocating what is a divine concept. It is like allocating a divine double of the self, ruh that belongs more to divinity than to ourselves. This is the real split we make. For ruh or soul to keep living as divine even after our own death. I would recommend reading Henry Corbin on Ibn al-Arabi, Alone with the Alone, and also his another book of The Cyclical Time and Smiley Gnosis on this one, and that explains quite a bit on the Islamic philosophy side of it. Just to contextualize with this concept, Corbin says, to be acquainted with what is best and oldest in yourself is to know yourself as you were before the world was made, before you emerged into me. Now, let's just take a pause here. Of course, I am not saying that there is a physical substance of a divine nature which was before time and then brought into the body from where I got the life. That would be quite childish to think this way. And I know most religious believers think like this. But these videos hopefully get them to pass this stage of concrete object-based imagery that they are instilled with. I'll be explaining it gradually. But here, let's continue with Corbin first. When I'm talking about the divine double, or in Henry Corbin's term, bi-unity, I use the word ruh. We respond to who are we by assigning our divine double and thus making ourselves a franchisee of divinity. The feeling of insecurity, detachment, loneliness, isolation, displacement is overcome with this split. And it's franchising with divinity. Let's take each feeling and discuss it. Let's go with the word insecurity first. The divine double, ruh, creates a special relationship between us and the divinity to create the idea of protection against insecurity. As if a portion of our inner self, the divine ruh, is always watching and would call in the divine intervention to resolve issues that we are facing now. So insecurity is not denied, or a sense of false security is not created. Rather, a hope is created that the divine help is reachable. And in any given case, he will come to help. And this is the idea of prayers or dua or anything that we use. Another feeling, detachment. Ruh having divine nature justifies the feeling of detachment from the perceivable world, which is this world that we are in. It presents as if we belong to an entirely different world and are here temporarily. This in turn creates the idea of roadless travel, that we are just in a travel, we are just passing through. Ruh does not create a new way to latch on and attach to the world. Rather, it creates more detachments from the world to be prepared to the other world. It requires creating more detachments, or live with the original idea of divinity by detaching ourselves from here. In other words, with this detachment, it creates a new sense of attachment to the divine. Loneliness. It removes loneliness by placing divinity in direct communication. Our divine double Ru is the only part that can communicate to the divine and make us alive. Or the other way around, the communication to divine is the part that gives life to the Ru. Even life means entirely differently just because of proximity of Ru and communication to divine. This communication is the essence of all religious enterprise. So Ru has a life of its own with this communication to the idea of the divine. And that's how the loneliness gets compensated. Isolation. The interesting part of life that is created through divine double is the end of this biunity. And the isolation gets completely nullified and we return to the essence that we came from. In Islam, we call it Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, meaning indeed we belong to Allah and indeed to Him we return. The best way to remove isolation is not its denial, rather its temporality and short life and ultimate return, dissolving isolation altogether in the notion of time. It is similar to the saying that when life appears as a disease, then death appears as its cure. It is not a pessimist view, rather the method to ensure problems are merely about to end soon. Displacement that we felt due to the magnanimous scale of natural landscape that I explained in the video 5. The natural landscape is pushed outside of the urban landscape to counter that feeling of displacement. But what it does, more and more so, with the sterilization of urbanity from the natural settings, is the ingrained feeling of artificiality. So natural is pushed out, urban landscape which we created for our own scale, now with that particular scale that we create for ourselves, is creating the idea of feeling of artificiality itself. This feeling of artificiality creates the feeling of being in matrix that is completely unreal in the urban landscape. So we are not merely pushing out natural landscape, but also constructing a mysterious idea of reality. And the purposiveness and function that we discussed in that video 5, tied to the urban landscape, get also tied to the idea of reality. There is one idea that we haven't explored properly yet. The idea of there. When we ask why are we here versus where else? And that is the idea of there. The idea of there creates a primal location, the location where the ultimate return will happen. It is the ultimate nature of the return that gives reality and life to the place called there with the witnessing of death. The place called there can never be real without the ultimate nature of death. Let's see what that reality is first, how that reality is constructed. I asked this question to a very creative philosopher, thinker of my professor, Mark Cousins of AA School of Architecture. He explained with Lacanian perspective. He mentioned what the reality is. Of how much, he's saying that when you have a credit card and you go to a shopping center to buy stuff, you have no sense of reality of how much to spend because you don't have the limits or the sense of it. But when you can perceive the credit card bill arriving at your doorstep that needed to be paid, that gives you a sense of reality. Let's build this idea of reality from Mark's example. Instead, if you have cash at hand, you have some sense of reality, as that we have limited amount in our pocket, that how much money we have in them, that is fine. The idea of the credit card is basically to create that gap of limit being removed. But the thing is, the reality hits when we think of the bill coming back on the doorstep with that number on it. And that's the idea of maturity and reality we perceive and we project. In our daily life, from youth to the older age, we move from credit card to the pocket change left in the deathbed of the hospital. So credit card is more like when we were young, and the pocket change left is the idea at the time of the death, or closer to the death, or the old age, etc. It is the end of life ultimately arriving at the doorstep that gives reality to the actionable item at hand in the present time, and to the idea of there as a place. Secondly, it's the question of there, which is not here. By there, it does not mean a different geography that I can present at instead. So I can be present there rather than here. So it's not just that. Rather it's the place where I am no longer minuscule. I am not that small in the complete nature, as we talked about in the video 5, that we feel too small in the overall scale. So I don't feel minuscule on that scale in the idea of there. This placement of there does not point towards natural settings outside of urban settings. Rather, it is the idea of there that is relevant to me within this urban settings, providing immediate value to me now. And what distinguishes there as a place is not merely the idea of time when we eventually arrive, but the death of time where time has to stop existing for my arrival. And this is the idea of there, where time has to stop existing. And the idea of self there can surpass the limits of non-existence. This idea of hereafter, or Quranic word Yawmuddin, I can discuss another time. That's an entire different thing to take it off. But at this moment, I would like to take a break here for a few minutes from our principal rationale and explore the idea of divine franchising of soul, or ruh, that I mentioned. I don't know if you know how franchising works. When we buy a franchise of McDonald's, for example, we make a commitment to pay them a certain commitment fee, spend a great capital cost to build the facility as per their requirements. The name and design will always be McDonald's and not our own. Abide by the rules and regulations in operations, get trained, buy raw materials from them, pay a certain fee on the gross sales, and they can shut you down anytime they want. And it never makes sense to buy one franchise, rather better to have minimum of 3 or 4 so that the management get easier. So if you go to a few of those franchising, they will not give it to one person. They would rather prefer the person who already have 2 or 3, they will give the franchise to them. So it only makes sense to have 2, 3. Anyways, that's the idea of franchising. The idea of divine double, or ruh, doesn't work very differently. We make an unconscious commitment to carve out and split the idea of the self called ruh. Mostly, initially it is performed by the parents. Either it is bayat or baptism or any other ritual. The unconscious commitment is made on behalf of the child. The divine double is always believed and seen as part of divine and not your own. Just like McDonald's name and design always remain the part of McDonald's. You will practice the faith and abide by the rules and regulation of what is established as divine, by whoever is the representative of the divine, creating the institution. All raw materials of faith will come from them. Stories, slogans, wisdom, everything has to be bought from that institution. This institution will, with the franchising of Ru, does enormous buying and selling in the society, and the transaction is made with of what we call truth and reality. It has the capacity to perform the truth transaction even when it is not creating the truth. A certain fee of the truth is assigned to divinity for a given statement or a concept to become true. What is that fee? It's the relationship between a statement to all the truth that a person considers, like other true statements and concepts, and homage to those truths that make a given statement true. It is homage to all the other truth concepts. That is the fee paid to make this given statement truth. So summarizing it all, the existential question, who are we and why are we here, merges into the question, what of I that is here? This creates the idea of divine double, Ru, that gets franchised to jointly build the idea of divinity with other people in the society. This idea of soul or Ru resolves quite some feelings like isolation, displacement, loneliness, etc. It is through this idea of franchising of Ru that belongs to religious domain to construct truth and reality. In another video, I will talk about the idea of the self that constructed with the divine double, or the idea of the Ru, and that we're calling it nafs. And that's the word used in Quran for the idea of the self.